Okay, now the purpose of this part of the lecture is very simply, sorry, I shouldn't move you around after I get started. Very simply, I intend to fill in the gaps for you with what you've read from Aristotle. This is not designed to be any kind of persuasive anything. I'm not going to start at point A and lead you step by step to point C like I would normally like to do. It might seem a little disjointed to you, but essentially my purpose is to explain what you're reading, recognizing that some things you may already know about, some you may not, and different students in the class may also be familiar with what others are unfamiliar with. So in Aristotle, Book 1, Chapter 1, that's where this discussion comes from. And in this chapter, which is really the start of his rhetoric, the very first thing you see Aristotle doing here is answering the objections of Socrates to the art and the study of rhetoric. Aristotle attempts to escape Socrates' charges against rhetoric, and he tries to do so three different ways. First thing he says is that rhetoric is an art that all men use. Everyone uses it. It is inescapable. The truth is that Socrates, even when he was objecting to rhetoric, was using rhetoric. And the irony is that Socrates is considered one of the great rhetoricians of all time. So all men use it. Secondly, he says that rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. Now that was important and strategic. You should understand it first, that Socrates held dialectic to be superior, the superior art. Aristotle is saying that you can't have dialectic without rhetoric. Here's why. No, I'll tell you why in a minute. Just hold on to that. The third attempt of Aristotle to answer Socrates' charge was in his definition of rhetoric. The definition comes at the beginning of chapter 2. I think you've already read that. I would assume that you have. When Aristotle defined rhetoric, he did not define it as the art of persuasion, as Gorgias did. He defined it instead as the definition, you've heard it several times now, the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So in other words, what Aristotle was saying is that rhetoric is not persuading. Rhetoric is finding the best way to persuade. What will be the most persuasive to a given audience? And so your success is not measured by whether you persuaded your audience or not, but rather how strong or weak your case was. All right, so let's go back. Aristotle related rhetoric to dialectic. What is dialectic? Well, dialectic, to put it in the simplest terms, dialectic refers to logic. And it's an interesting relationship. Aristotle says that it's the counterpart of dialectic, and here's why. If you're going to speak clearly and effectively, you must think clearly and effectively. So if you don't use logic, you won't use rhetoric rightly. That's the point. Douglas Wilson, in an essay he wrote in Repairing the Ruins, said before a man can speak clearly and effectively, he must be able to think clearly and effectively. If he does not know what he is saying, it is unlikely that anyone else will. As Cato stated, grasp the subject, the words will follow. This is why a mastery of the grammar and dialectic of education must precede the teaching of rhetoric. That's why, if I could throw this in our school, which is a classical and Christian school, we follow the trivium, which you've been reading about. Grammar is the elementary years, dialectic is the middle school years, rhetoric comes in 11th and 12th grade, 10th, 11th, 12th, but we don't teach it till 11th grade. Aristotle also exposes the shortcomings of the current treatises, the textbooks on rhetoric at his time. those textbooks would have focused on arousing emotions, arousing prejudice, anger, pity, and so on. Emotional appeal. Aristotle said they're not even dealing with the essentials of rhetoric. They're dealing with non-essentials. Now remember that the current treatises Aristotle referred to would have been either purely sophistic or heavily influenced by sophistry. Aristotle says that the modes of persuasion are the only true constituents of the art. Now, the modes of persuasion refer to ethos, pathos, and logos. I know the O's should all sound the same, but I can't say logos. The three artistic modes of persuasion, ethos, pathos, logos. We'll discuss those in more detail, in more depth later on. Enthymemes, which Aristotle calls the substance of rhetorical persuasion, belong to logos. Aristotle discusses political and forensic oratory in this chapter. Now we'll spend more time on these two later on, but for now you need to understand that political oratory refers to oratory that recommends a particular course of action, persuades us to do or not to do something. Forensic oratory refers to oratory that examines what has already been done and judges whether it was right or wrong, whether it was just or unjust, in order to praise it or condemn it. Forensic oratory is the oratory that a prosecutor and a defense attorney will engage in. Trial law. All right. Political oratory is what our legislators engage in, what our Senate and our House of Representatives deal with. Aristotle says that rhetorical study in its strict sense is concerned with the modes of persuasion. What does he mean by persuasion? And how does he identify those modes of persuasion? This is discussed, by the way, if you're following along, I hope you're following along in Aristotle. It's discussed in the middle paragraph, right at 1355a. Aristotle describes persuasion as a demonstration and says that we are most fully persuaded when we consider a thing to have been demonstrated. This fits with something Aristotle argued later on, that we find logical demonstration more persuasive even though we enjoy examples and illustrations more. When someone makes their case and demonstrates what they're arguing, we like that more, we appreciate it more as well. Aristotle talks here about enthymemes and syllogisms. That's the next thing we need to discuss. We discussed that earlier. I think in one of our video lectures, I talked a little bit about enthymemes and syllogisms and what the difference is between the two. Essentially, an enthymeme is a rhetorical syllogism. A syllogism is something very familiar in logic class. It's used heavily in logic. It's a very formal debate. It's not the kind of, a very formal argument. It's not the kind of argument that you would hear in everyday life, in your classrooms and in your discussions with your friends and so on. The syllogism follows a very strict format that includes a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. For example, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is a mortal. Enthymemes are syllogisms with one statement left assumed or left unstated, left missing, understood. With the syllogism that I just gave you, we could leave out any part. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is immortal. We could say Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. That would be an enthymeme. We could say all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is immortal. That would be that would be an enthymeme. I'm sorry. We could say all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. And you would understand from that that means that Socrates is immortal. That's the relationship between the two. But it's interesting that Aristotle brings that up because, again, he's saying that Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. So he shows you what the dialectic would use, which is a syllogism. And then he says, this is what we do in rhetoric. In rhetoric, and enthymemes are much closer to the kind of arguments we make. We're not even as formal as an enthymeme. Your mom says, clean your room or you're in trouble. All right? Or she may even say, you better get that room clean right now. And you know if you don't get it clean, you're in trouble. So it becomes very informal in everyday life. But nonetheless, the point he's making is that the key arguments, the most important arguments, and what produces persuasion in rhetoric comes from logic. This is what Aristotle is doing. He's connecting rhetoric to dialectic. Logic plays an important role in rhetoric because all the tricks of sophistry aside, persuasion lasts and is more meaningful when we believe that the argument has been demonstrated. Aristotle gives 4 reasons why rhetoric is useful. Because, he says, first of all, it gives us the ability to cause the truth to prevail. Things that are true and things that are just have a natural tendency to prevail over their opposites. Secondly, he said rhetoric is useful. Rhetoric is useful because it helps us know how to persuade those we cannot instruct. He said this, before some audiences, not even the possession of the exactest knowledge will make it easy for what we say to produce conviction. For argument based on knowledge implies instruction, and there are people whom one cannot instruct. I bet you've met a few. Thirdly, rhetoric is useful because it helps us to be able to argue both sides in a case when one argues unfairly and we must confute him. We need to know both sides of whatever it is that we're arguing. We need to know both sides because we need to know whether our opponent is arguing fairly or unfairly, but also because we need to know what we need to answer in order to refute our opponent. This is what Aristotle said. We must be able to employ persuasion just as strict reasoning can be employed on opposite sides of a question, not in order that we may in practice employ it in both ways, for we must not make people believe what is wrong, but in order that we may see clearly what the facts are, and that if another man argues unfairly, we on our part may be able to confute him. The fourth reason that Aristotle gave for the usefulness of rhetoric is that it helps a man be able to defend himself with speech and reason. This is an interesting one. Aristotle said it is absurd to hold that a man ought to be ashamed of being unable to defend himself with his limbs, but not of being unable to defend himself with speech and reason. And if it be objected that one who uses such power of speech unjustly might do great harm, that is a charge which may be made in common against all good things except virtue, and above all against the things that are most useful, as strength, health, wealth, generalship. Aristotle is saying that any good thing can be abused. Now he's saying that clearly in answer to Socrates, who is speaking of the way rhetoric is abused. Socrates objected that rhetoric is a form of flattery. You're manipulating, misusing speech. And Aristotle is saying, no, anything good, wealth, health, fame, all of it can be misused. And rhetoric not excluded from that. But a man does need to be able to defend himself. Now, from this, Aristotle leads into what the true function of rhetoric is. And we'll see in the next chapter that he develops his definition of rhetoric from that. This is what Aristotle said. It is clear further that its function is not simply to succeed in persuading, but rather to discover the means of coming as near such success as the circumstances of each particular case allow. Furthermore, he said, it is plain that it is the function of one and the same art to discern the real and the apparent means of persuasion, just as it is the function of dialectic to discern the real and apparent syllogism. Then Aristotle identifies, and this is really the last nail in the coffin of Socrates' objections. Aristotle identifies what makes a man a sophist, which is not his faculty. Pardon me. So it's more than just an approach or a school of thought. Aristotle identifies that the problem with sophistry is his moral purpose, the sophist's moral purpose. His faculty is to find a way to persuade you. But when his moral purpose is to persuade at any cost, that's the problem.